conditions are changing. And the reason the price isn't changing is the demand conditions aren't changing. Yeah, Eric.
So for the movie theater example,
yeah.
the reason you said the costs are different is because the movie theater will be empty on like Sunday, like less full on Sunday than on Saturday, right? So like the cost of having you there filling up a seat is much less. But how is that different from airlines, for example, charging you less when like near the end, like a day before the flight? Yeah. How is that different from that? You know, when they're like, oh, we've got an empty seat that would cost very little to fill.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's some truth to that. That's possibly one explanation for it. My guess is it doesn't explain all of it, but I think that might be right. And I think those special last-minute deals sell out too quickly for that really to be the case. But that could be true. So another imperfect form of price discrimination is to group people not on the basis of how they behave, but on the basis of who they are. So you use some objective characteristic to charge them different prices. In particular, you try to charge lower prices to people who you think have more elastic demand, right? So this is a very common strategy in entertainment and transportation. And Amanda, can you think of some examples of just charging different prices, not to people based on what they buy, but just on who they are?
Medicine?
Yeah, sure. So, in particular, what are you thinking?
So, for example, if a person is really sick and has like some sort of, has a sort of extra care that the medicine, and if they buy a lot, then it's going to be cheaper. But if the person just needs it one time, then it's going to be a little bit more. But
see, that's based more on their behavior. But can you think of something that's based purely on something that, like, I can just see about you?
What do you mean?
Like charging some type of person more than you charge some other type of person, not based on what they did, but just based on who they are.
Yeah, for example, in the movies.
Yeah, the senior citizens is a perfect example, or students get a lower price as well. That's right. Another example is libraries have to pay a lot more for journals than you would have to pay to subscribe yourself, because they're willing to pay a lot more to have it in the library. Another example, which I think is actually pretty funny. So I went to Equinox Gym on the north side, and I was thinking about joining there, and they were like going to give me a big discount because I'm an educator. I don't think they realized that like professors probably earn as much as like most people that come to their gym, but they sort of thought I was like, you know, some inner city teacher who was like earning nothing, right? But because I'm an educator, you know, even though it doesn't really indicate anything about my income, they were going to offer me a much lower price. Another example is, which is also along the lines of what Amanda was saying, is you charge lower prices in developing countries for drugs, right, or for books. Another example is if you can prove that you're a student, you get a much lower price for Microsoft Word and Microsoft Office. If you're at a big corporation, you have to pay like 4 or 5 times as much. Also, things like unemployment insurance or giving people a higher price, higher taxes if they're taller, which we'll talk about in a moment, are ideas of discriminating against people based on characteristics of themselves they can't change. Yeah?
Just wondering, what stops like libraries from signing up as individuals?
Well, that can be a problem, but usually you can identify it. Like, you know, they have to tell the truth or they'll go to jail or something like that.
Maybe it's law and stuff?
Yeah. Yeah.
Does this count for the home and office software licensing? Does it count if we're talking about upgrades? Like it takes $100 to upgrade from XP to Windows 7.
Yep.
But if you buy a new Windows 7, it costs $300. Would that fall into this category?
I think that's a little bit more second degree because it's based more on your behavior and less on who you are, you know what I mean? But these things are always subtly different from one another, but I would say that's more in that category, yeah.
And for number 2, wouldn't it be the case that libraries are just they'll just have to pay more because multiple people are going to be using the journal.
Well, so that's an argument you can make. You can make that in some sense it's sort of like cost, though it's not really like cost, because it's not like it really costs anything to supply the journal. It's more to supply the journal to them. But yeah, you could say in some sense it's a little bit more like that, because it's like you're undermining my ability to sell to other people or something like that. Another example is, if you go especially to most developing countries, it's really, really cheap to go to like the national parks if you're from the country. And if you're not from the country, it's really, really expensive. So I bet, Marie, you get a good price in Guatemala on all of the things, and if you bring along another American friend, they have to pay like 5 times as much, right? Another great example of this is actually, if you go to most restaurants in Chinatown, they have like a secret Chinese menu, and that both has the best food on it, and it's like costs like half as much, because basically like they think all the Americans are going to be scared from ordering from the Chinese menu, and so it's a way to like discriminate and charge lower price. That people followed it perfectly. But the main point that I was trying to make is that there's a pretty relatively simple analysis you can do of these things, even if it's not something we want to do all the time. But the result that we get out of that, I think, is a bit puzzling, which is that it seems like everything, whether discrimination improves or reduces output, whether it improves or reduces social surplus, is very complicated and ambiguous and depends on a whole bunch of details of what's going on. But we know that perfect price discrimination is more socially efficient than no discrimination, that it reduces consumer surplus, and that it increases profits. So it seems like you could get to perfect price discrimination by doing a series of third-degree price discriminations, right? You could break the market into 2 groups, right? And then within each of those groups, you could break each of those into 2 groups, right? And just keep doing that until you get down to charging each individual person a different price. And that, it seems like, would lead you to perfect price discrimination, which we know has lower consumer surplus and higher total surplus than no discrimination does. So shouldn't each step of the way also give you more producer surplus, more consumer surplus, less consumer surplus, and more social surplus? And I think that the right answer is that it's true. Any individual act of third-degree price discrimination could, in principle, do lots of different things. But typically, it sort of has to be the case that usually what goes on has the same intuition as first-degree price discrimination. That is, usually what must be happening is that things must be getting more socially efficient, but reducing consumer surplus. So a simple example of how that might work is, imagine that we took the market and we split it up in a particular way, which is we're going to segment it into 2 parts. A price that we charge to people who are willing to pay more than a certain amount, or a price that we're going to charge to people who are willing to pay less than a certain amount. We just slice it in that way. So imagine that the point where we slice it is less than the price that we're currently charging, right? Then the lower part of the market was completely unserved. And therefore, it's just good for everybody, right? On the other hand, if this is greater than the price that we're currently charging, then we're going to charge in the high market exactly the price at which we cut things. So we'll serve everyone in that market, right? And in the low market, we'll reduce the price. So in that case, we get exactly what we wanted. That's going to reduce consumer surplus and increase the total surplus. Because it reduces consumer surplus because you take the people in the high market and you charge them a higher price. And so it seems reasonable to think that this sort of thing, if not exactly this thing, is sort of the typical way to slice up demand. Is to take people who are willing to pay more, take people who are willing to pay less, and slice them in that way, rather than adding up 2 different smooth demand curves to get some kinked demand curve or something like that. So I think it's, even though you should keep in mind that there's these more complicated possibilities, a good first approximation is to think that at every step of third-degree price discrimination, total social welfare increases, but consumer surplus falls. Okay. Now, one common application of price discrimination is to auction design. Because auctions are very much like the monopoly problem as we talked about last lecture. If I raise the reserve price, I get a higher price, but I sell with a lower probability, right? And so the only real difference in an auction and a monopoly problem is that when I'm, in an auction, when I'm dealing with any individual buyer, the opportunity cost to me of selling to that buyer is the chance to sell to another buyer, right? Because that's exactly what the auction does. So we can then think of the quantity as being for any given buyer, as being the probability that he'll purchase at that price. So the cumulative distribution, 1 minus f of p. And so we can just call his quantity Q is equal to 1 minus f of p, right? And so as long as marginal revenue is decreasing, you always want to assign the object to whoever is willing to pay the most, because they're going to be the one that has the highest marginal revenue, right? And this marginal revenue that I could make by selling to someone else is exactly the opportunity cost of selling to you. And so the English auction, or any auction where people say their values and then we assign it to the person who values it the most, is just a simple way of implementing this rule, that whoever has the highest marginal revenue kind of gets it. But this assumes that everyone has the same marginal revenue. That is, everyone has the same distribution of willingnesses to pay. But that's clearly not the case. And Alex, what do you think you'd want to do? Imagine you knew some buyer was much more elastic than some other buyer. What do you think you'd want to do in terms of the offer you'd want to make him about how to purchase the product?
You would want a lower price.
Yeah. So what do you think that would correspond to in an auction? Imagine you and Ben are competing in an auction, and I want to offer you a lower price than I want to offer Ben. How would I do that in an auction?
Well, the good goes to the highest bidder, right?
Well, it does in a normal auction if you both have the same, if you're both identical people and I can't tell you apart, that makes perfect sense, right? Because I want to assign it to the person with the higher marginal revenue. Right? But if you are more elastic, I know you're poor and Ben's rich, what am I going to want to do?
Sell it to the rich guy.
Well, you're going to want to sell it to the rich guy, but you're going to want to get a lot of money out of the rich guy.
Right. Oh, so you would want me to act like I would pay, or you would want this, so you would want him to think that I would pay more.
Exactly. So how might you do that in an auction?
Keep it anonymous.
Yeah, so one thing you might do is you might give you a handicap. That is, you might say, look, Ben can win, but he's got to beat you by a certain amount.
Okay.
That's effectively like offering you a lower price than you're offering to him. And you're exploiting the fact that you know that your marginal revenue, basically, is higher than his marginal revenue is. Right?
Right.
So that's exactly what people do in auctions. Is that they think about what's the distribution of different people's willingness to pay, what's their marginal revenue, and then rather than assigning it to the highest bidder, you assign it to the person who has the highest marginal revenue, given the value that they announce.
But what if he actually wins? What if I don't bid enough to be higher than him? Then you're losing money because...
Well, that's true, but you're still better off on average, because you always want to set it equal to the point where so I mean, that's just like saying that, if you offer too low of a quantity, you won't sell the efficient amount, you know what I mean? But still, you're better off because you get a higher price in all the situations where you happen to have a higher value than that.
You're saying on average of all the offers,
Yeah.
you would be better.
Exactly.
The seller would be better off.
Yeah. So the principle is you always want to assign it to the person who has the highest marginal revenue, not to the person who has the highest value. Because that is, I mean, it's just exactly the same price discrimination logic we've been talking about. If Alex, I know, isn't willing to pay as much, I should give him a better chance of winning, because that encourages him to bid more aggressively and forces up the price that Ben's going to have to pay.